What I do think is quite possible under the circumstances, given the way in which gender discussions are going, etc., is that under those circumstances, you might find some very interesting sudden professions of gender changes happening. And I would look out for that one. I wouldn't have said that 10 years ago, but I think that becomes increasingly possible.
Well, I think it's unlike. I mean, I've never taken that whole idea that people. I think being trans is so incredibly difficult. I don't think people would do that. But anyway, that's a whole different debate we don't want to get into.
Parliament in the Palace of Westminster is not a professional setting. It's a ludicrous setting.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's a professional piece of work. But it's sort of organised in a kind of unprofessional way. And I guess I think there's a point about, I'm sort of coming round to that view a bit.
Meet the Cerberus of columnists, the Janus of journalism, and the ultimate political portmanteau of opinion.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Finkelvitch with Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch on Times Radio.
Yes. It's time for Finkelvitch, joined this morning by Daniel Finkelstein. Morning, Danny.
Good morning. I've actually got an idea for a political musical. I thought of one based on the federal assumption of state debt and the creation of the Constitution. I thought I'd call it Hamilton.
Very good, very good. Your known creativity coming in there, Danny. David Aaronovitch, good morning.
Good morning. Has anybody come up with this one yet? Wokelahoma.
Oh, very good.
Come on, that is good.
That's much better than Danny's. Well done. That might be the best we get all morning. If you could do better than Wokelahoma, get in touch in the usual ways. Right. Let's talk about. We don't need to get bogged down in what Neil Parish was exactly doing, because now he's announced that he's going. Although if you want to share your intimate knowledge of tractors, feel free. There's, as a result, lots of pressure on the Conservatives. Something must be done. That something is a recommitment to its existing commitment to move towards having 50-50 men and women on the Tory benches in the House of Commons. But the party's always been against having all-women shortlists. In fact, Michelle Donnellan, the Universities Minister, describing the idea as demeaning. So I suppose, Danny, there's two questions here. How do the Tories... Well, I suppose there's several questions. Do the Tories need more women? How do they do it? And if not all women shortlists, then what?
Well, yes, the Conservative Party does need more women. And then there's this question of whether or not it is sort of ethically right to discriminate on the basis of sex, even when you're discriminating in favour of a discriminated against group, which is women. And the extraordinary thing is that the Conservative Party, in many ways, supposed to be the pragmatic party, gets itself tangled up in what is really an ideological position. In the end, it seems that positive discrimination of this kind, of trying to ensure that you have enough women candidates, is literally the only way of offsetting negative discrimination in the selection of women candidates. It's the only thing that's worked. It's the only thing I think that will work for some time to come, while our society begins to adjust itself to a sort of new reality and in relationships between sexes and genders, and it needs to understand that as a party, and therefore I think positive discrimination is the only way of achieving that. The problem is if you were to select in large groups, you had 4 or 5 constituencies selecting their candidates at once, you'd be able then to get 2 women and 2 men in each group. It wouldn't be very difficult to do, and I think most constituencies would agree to that. But because you select one at a time, you end up getting men everywhere. And that just isn't tenable. The Conservative Party can't represent the whole of the population if its population of MPs doesn't. So I long ago, when I was in my 20s, and when you're particularly impressed by pure lines and, and you're particularly impressed by ideological arguments about things, you feel differently. But I've now watched what works, and I've shifted my position on that quite a long time ago.
David, where do you stand on this question?
I have to say, it's a slightly bizarre response to the Neil Parish thing to say that you need more women in Parliament, because the answer to the Neil Parish thing is that you have no men in Parliament. So you should literally have all women shortlists except for every single seat. It's the only way in which you can kind of guarantee it. I mean, for some reason, women tend not to be looking for tractors and finding porn. I don't know why this. Maybe it's just a lack of imagination on their part, a lack of imaginative capacity. But taking Danny's serious point, the all women shortlist work for Labour. I mean, there's, whether it worked electorally is another matter, I disagree, but it certainly vastly increased the numbers of women on the Labour benches. The Liberal Democrats didn't do it, and at one stage, Liberal Democrats were absolutely the worst represented by women. They've done rather better more recently, putting up more women in by-elections and so on. So pragmatically, all women shortlists do work, and what you could see them as a kind of, if you like, a pump primer, really, which is you don't have to do it forever, but you do it so that you overcome the resistance which there is and the kind of tendency which there is, particularly for conservative associations, to choose men on an individual basis. And then, maybe 10, 15 years down the line, you find it unnecessary. What I do think is quite possible under the circumstances, given the way in which gender discussions are going, etc., is that under those circumstances, you might find some very interesting sudden professions of gender changes happening. And I would look out for that one. I wouldn't have said that 10 years ago, but I think that becomes increasingly possible.
Well, I think it's unlike. I mean, I've never taken that whole idea that people. I think being trans is so incredibly difficult. I don't think people would do that. But anyway, that's a whole different debate we don't want to get into. Not right now. We can do it another time, perhaps. But I think that. Because there's such a strong negative bias against women, it turns out you have to do a lot of work to ensure that you're properly representative. I don't think it would have made any difference to, as David correctly said, I think it would have made no difference to the Neil Parish incident. But I do think it would be a good thing in itself.
I suppose. I mean, the slight problem with stories like this is that people are very cross about what Neil Parish was doing, and they think the solution just happens to be the thing that they've been banging on about for a long time. So somehow we've got into MPs shouldn't be employing their own staff, says Lindsay Hoyle. Other people saying we should shut the bars. I mean, you can have a debate about both of those questions, but neither of them played any role, as far as I could tell, in Neil Parish's fat-fingered internet search.
Of course, neither. But it wasn't. It wasn't so obviously simply fat-fingered, but fat-headed. It certainly was. And the truth is that none of these are solutions to that particular incident. Which is something that he did and has correctly. Receive the consequences of. So I think what we should just do is say, well, as they've come up on the political agenda, because now we're considering this whole question, are they a good idea? And I think I'm not sure. I think it's a good idea for people not to be able to employ their own staff, because I think it would undermine the whole question of the independence of members of Parliament. But I do think there are big questions about the bars and drinking in Parliament. But I'm a little bit biased because I don't drink at all, so maybe other people feel differently about it.
But it's all part of the. To me, it's all part of the same kind of incredible archaic nature of Parliament and the way we keep it. We insist on being in a building which is entirely unfit for purpose. We don't allow obvious things like electronic voting, which requires extraordinary, unnecessary exertions by MPs in order to vote. And I don't know, Dan, whether you now have electronic voting in the Lords or not.
We've had it for funny. We've had it. We're now moving to a system whereby there's electronic pass reading, but you have to go through. So that there are pluses and minuses to electronic voting, by the way, because obviously that is related. I think that is related a bit to Neil Parish. I think that probably the kind of atmospherics that people don't get is there's an awful lot of hanging around in Parliament quite late outside work hours, where people are sitting there reading things or doing things and sort of feel they no longer need to work because they've been working all day and it's now 9 o'clock at night or whatever. That sort of thing is probably bundled up with the fact that people drink or behave in a grotesquely unprofessional manner, and that probably is related to Parliament's working methods. So I think you're right, David. The problem with electronic voting is you can then get into a situation where people are voting while not paying any, not being sort of in the building, working in any way, or relating to their parliamentary task, and barely aware there is a bill going through Parliament.
But I suppose the problem with that, Danny, is that the vast majority of votes that happen in the House of Commons, the people voting have no idea what they're voting on. It's a
but I'm not sure that's a trend we want to particularly encourage. It's without any question, it's obviously convenient for members of Parliament to be able to vote without having to physically attend.
Yeah.
I think you would lose quite a lot. So one example of is that voting lobbies are one of the few places where ministers encounter backbench members of Parliament. If you remove that, you'd massively reduce that. So what I'm saying is, look, I actually think, funny enough, this probably is related to the Neil Parish, unlike the other things. It is related to what happened with Neil Parish. So I'm not sure. I think you'd lose some things as well as gaining. So it's a pluses and minuses.
Okay. I think one of the things that you would gain, Danny, take your point, is actually moving into the 20th century, let alone the 21st century. I mean, the situation where, and it is mostly mothers with young children, have to actually be present to vote in person on 3-line whips, etc., when they could actually see their kids a little bit more and make and do those votes. It's just archaic. It's out of time. And if we're talking about
most of those votes take place during the day, so it's only some minority. But I do get it. I mean, I've noticed it. I've said it sometimes with the Lords where they're voting incredibly late at night, and I'm thinking, well, that's because we didn't start until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But on the other hand, that allows people, in the Lords, it makes more sense because people are not doing that as a job, so that's different. But I think Parliament. I think that definitely the Neil Parish incident is related to some extent to an archaic atmosphere in which people are doing a lot of voting which involves hanging around a lot, and I think that is unquestionably related to it. I mean, it's not an excuse for it.
My counterpoint, as someone who's done a certain amount of hanging around Parliament in the past, is the implication that every man, when left with 10 minutes on his hands between voting, goes on a porn website. Or anyone who goes into a bar in Westminster automatically starts sexually harassing anyone they can lay their hands on.
But we correctly, look, in journalism, as everyone knows, certainly before the 1950s and 60s, people were quite often drunk in the office. If you came in drunk in the Times once now, it would be like a massive disciplinary issue. And it's correct that we've moved to that, right? It's not a way of working. And so no one's arguing that because people are hanging around, it excuses it or, entirely explains what was bizarre behaviour. But unquestionably, if you have a working life in which quite a lot of the day ends up being outside professional hours when people have done full working days and people are hanging around doing all the things that they do when they hang around, which includes getting drunk, by the way, and then obviously, as we've now noticed, also includes people accessing porn, right? You're creating, and David's right, a kind of an unprofessional atmosphere in a professional setting. So I do think that is related a bit, much more than I think the other issues we were discussing.
Except, and this is my final point, Parliament in the Palace of Westminster is not a professional setting. It's a ludicrous setting.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's a professional piece of work, but it's sort of organised in a kind of unprofessional way. And I guess I think there's a point about, I'm sort of coming round to that view a bit, that possibly isn't an appropriate setting.
Well, we shall move on. We shall move on in a moment. We'll talk about Partygate, Beergate, and we'll try and discuss what's been coming out of America as well on the latest on Roe versus Wade. This is Matt Chorley bringing you Finkelvitch on Times Radio with Visa, supporting small businesses on their digital journey.